a 5-minute recap on what they did.
Okay.
Sorry, is there no other people joining? Don't we usually start like 5 minutes later or something?
That is true.
Usually there's a link sent out for me to send. You get what I mean? To join the meeting. Or on the youth group, because nothing is on there.
We are live.
Oh, we're live on Facebook.
Tari, is it winter?
It's cold.
All right.
Facebook link.
All right. I think we're live, guys. Okay, let's have a quick word of prayer before we start. Our Lord in heaven, thank you for giving us this opportunity to come together as young people to study your word, Lord. May you help us to understand the prophecies that we'll go through this afternoon, Lord. And may we all be blessed, Lord, and actually take something out of this. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So
Amen.
Good afternoon, everybody. I understand we have an audience online. So welcome, one and all. So I'll begin by just giving a quick overview of where we started with this series, the presentation that I did, and then Lukshin will do the same.
What, man?
So we started off with Daniel 1 and 2. We went through the story of the children of Israel when they got taken captive by the Babylonians. We briefly touched on the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then we moved on to King Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the statue, which was made up of a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of brass, and legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. So we basically went through this statue and explained what the head, chest, thighs, legs, feet actually represented. And we found these to be empires that ruled at particular points of our world's history. And we saw that the head of gold symbolized Babylon. The chest and arms of silver represented Medo-Persia, and then the belly and thighs of brass were symbolic of the Greek Empire. The legs of iron symbolized pagan Rome, and then we had the feet of iron and clay, basically symbolic of Rome as well, but divided Rome, papal Rome. So I'll hand over to Lukshin, who will give an overview of what he spoke about regarding Daniel 7, again, which is a similar prophecy. Well, not similar, or same prophecy, but using different symbols to bring out the point across. Gibson.
Hello, hi everybody, how you doing? So for my presentation last week, we looked at Daniel 7, and in Daniel 7, we saw four beasts. The first one was the lion with wings on it. This was symbolic of Babylon. The lion was a symbol in the Babylonian era for Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king for that time. And then second came the Medo-Persians, the Medes and the Persians, sorry. And these were described as a bear with 3 bones in its mouth, 3 ribs in its mouth. These were symbolic of the kingdoms that they had devoured. We also mentioned how this Cyrus, the one who actually conquered Babylon, was mentioned in a prophecy beforehand, before the actual event happened. I think it was in the book of Isaiah that mentions it. Then we also saw a leopard. This was the third animal. The leopard had wings on it, and it had 4 heads on it. This was symbolic of Greece, Alexander the Great, and and how he came to power so quickly and conquered so much of the world in such a very short time. But then he died fairly sudden, and his kingdom was broken into 4 different pieces, which were taken over by 4 different generals that we did speak about, symbolic of the 4 heads on the animal. And then lastly, the last beast was not defined by way of an animal, but it was mentioned as one that was going to be exceedingly dreadful, with iron teeth, brass nails. It had 10 horns, and a little horn then grew from 3 of the 10 horns. So we mentioned how this was symbolic of Babylon. Oh, sorry, not Babylon, sorry. This was symbolic of the Roman Empire. Iron and brass were metals that were very common within the Babylonian, sorry, not Babylonian, in the Roman Empire, sorry. So from Rome, we know that 10 kingdoms grew out of it. And these are the Western kingdoms where modern day Europe comes out of, really. And from those 10 kingdoms, historically, we also saw that 3 of those 10 kingdoms are no longer in existence. And they were taken out just at the time when the little horn was coming up. And historically, we identified the little Rome to be the papacy. So that was, in essence, what we discussed. We also mentioned how there's Michael shall stand up, and he went, sorry, not Michael, the Son of Man went to God the Father and then received the dominion over all the world. And this was when his kingdom is going to come at the end. This was also in contrast. It's the same thing that happened with the rock at the end, that at the end in Daniel 2, that came over and knocked the whole image down. The same thing here. That rock represents Christ, and Christ shall come and do away with all the kingdoms that have been, and his kingdom will be everlasting. Thank you very much. I think that's it. Sorry, who's got a cat as their picture? That's that is mad distracting.
That's really the message that's worrying you right now.
Wow.
Wow.
Jin.
All right, okay. So welcome one and all to everyone who's just joined in and who's watching us live from wherever you are. I hope you've had a blessed Sabbath day so far. Yeah, and I hope you're surviving throughout this this trying season, as it were. Yeah, so as you've heard, we've had a quick recap of what has happened so far, or what we've discussed so far. So we've identified from Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 the various different beasts or the various different nations that are to be involved in this, for lack of a better phrase, world conquering in their different periods. So we've got the Babylonian Empire, we had the Medo-Persian Empire, and we've had the Grecian Empire, and obviously the Roman Empire, and then obviously a Holy Rome at the end of it that has been presented by Eugene and Lucian over the last couple of weeks. So just a question out there to everyone as we go along. So if you've been part of the study for the last 2 weeks especially, you would have noticed a theme, or you'd have noticed something happening as we delve into each chapter. So between chapter 2 and chapter 7, in as much as they're speaking about the same things, what have you actually noticed happening here? If anyone would care to weigh in.
Yeah, so I've noticed that God likes to repeat things quite a lot, and I think that's for us to understand it. But every time he repeats it, he brings out a bit more detail, and he gives you something that you can understand more. It's like in Daniel 2, he gave like an overview of the world, and then in Daniel 7, he like really zoned in on the last power to help us to understand what it was, because for whatever reason, he really wanted us to be able to identify what that power is, because it's the power that he will eventually crushes the rock. And then even like in Daniel 8, then there's even more focus on other things that start to pop up relating to that power. So every single time God tells you something, he's giving you more, because maybe he knows we can't handle everything at once.
That you've hit the nail right on the head. Literally, that's exactly what I was going for. So if you focus on Daniel chapter 2, it's just a big statue, isn't it? You've just got a statue with a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And the dream interpretation just goes as simple as you, Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, and then there'll be the next kingdom, and that kingdom, and that kingdom, that kingdom, and then it ends there, right? And then you go into Daniel chapter 7, where you've got the 4 beasts with more detail on them. For example, the lopsided bear, symbolizing the different weighting and power of the Medo-Persian Empire, so to speak, as Lucian was describing last week. So you're absolutely right. With each vision, it's the same story, except with more detail. So we're slowly magnifying onto what God is going for. So without much further ado, as suggested by one of my friends, we're going to get into Daniel chapter 8. And I'm going to start by reading Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 to 14. And then we'll get into our discussion. So, and it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but it cast him to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore, the male goat grew very great, and when he became strong, and the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, towards the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one that was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, here's to hoping that, as we said last week, if you guys could go away and read for yourselves. What were your first thoughts? Because I know a lot of us have now done some research into it, but before we go into what we have, what were your initial first thoughts at reading just the vision before we get into the interpretation? What came to mind? Don't all come at me at once.
I think the first thing that I found quite interesting was the use of the ram and the sorry, yeah, the ram as like a representation of like a kingdom, basically. So the animals themselves, I think that was one thing that was quite key for me.
Awesome. Any particular reason why they were key for you, or it's just something that kind of just cropped up for you?
I think initially, when I started reading about the ram and the goat, I didn't know exactly like where, like why those were the representations. Because remember in Daniel chapter 7, you have these beasts that represent a particular kingdom. So I was thinking, okay, why have these animals been used? But looking into further study, I think it just made more sense. Like, but initially, I just didn't know why it was those animals that were used to.
It's almost like you'd have expected to see a lopsided bear versus a leopard with wings, isn't it?
Yeah,
to
yeah.
kind of represent what was being said in Daniel 7.
Yeah, I think for me it was just the fact that like you come from these beasts that like are very disfigured, and then suddenly you have something that you can actually recognize. So that was the very first thing that just stuck out to me when I read into it.
Okay. Anyone else?
Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Right. For me, it wasn't even anything to do with prophecy or meanings or anything like that. It's just the fact that this guy must have been, because you said don't get into meanings, yeah? Yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
This guy must have been very traumatized, because seeing all these things, you can't be all right after seeing all these things. And it makes sense why at the end of it, he says, I was not well for quite some time. Because this has been happening for quite some time. And I can imagine if that was to happen now to somebody, you'd probably end up in a mental institution being medicated because you're seeing a lot of things. But obviously it comes with a meaning, which then clarifies a lot of the confusion.
No, that makes complete sense. I get that, yeah, because you kind of have to you have to wonder what kind of other dreams he was having. But obviously, like you said, they've got a lot of meaning behind them. So if we get straight into the vision, see
one thing as well, Dion, I wanted to say, I think one of the reasons that God is using different symbols sometimes for the same kingdom is to display certain characteristics about that kingdom. And that just helps us to further have no doubt about which kingdoms he's talking about. So when you talk about the goat, I'll sort of comment on why I think the goat was used in this particular prophecy. And this is regarding Alexander's son, and the coins that they used at the time, which had a goat inscribed on them as well. So
really?
Yeah, so I just read a little bit about that. And Alexander the Great's son actually was referred to as, so his name was Roxana, was named Alexander Agus, which basically means son of the goat. So again, it just means you can't argue with the fact that Greece was that goat, but we will touch on that later on anyway.
It kind of puts a new meaning to our usual arguments about who's the GOAT of all time in terms of football, isn't it? GOAT.
Yeah.
But anyway, we move forward. So in the Bible, interestingly enough, so I'm going to see if I can share my screen here for a second. So I do have a presentation of sorts over here. And that starts from the beginning. I was avoiding that. Can you guys see this? Just that, because I don't want to start the whole presentation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can you guys see my screen? So just starting from the four winds and the ram and the goat, as mentioned by Nonsi, The four winds say, as you can see on the slide, saw a ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. Before I even go further than that, what does that say to you? Where's this ram coming from then? Any takers? So rather, would it be fair then to say that this ram is coming from the east because it's the only direction it's not pushing towards?
Yeah.
It's coming directly from the east because you're pushing west, you're pushing north, you're pushing south. So that means everything in the east is behind you and you've either already trampled on them or that's where you're coming from. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So within the Bible, there are only two other moments when the ram and the male goat are mentioned together. Again, that's the consecration of the sanctuary in Numbers chapter 7 and on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus. So the ram was sacrificed, the male goat in both cases, apart from the specific meaning of the vision, the sanctuary and the judgment and the Day of Atonement is highlighted through the symbols. So obviously, as we've all read ahead within our study of Daniel 8, we do have a ram at the beginning, then we have a goat taking over, then we have persecution in between, but we do have a Day of Atonement, if you will, after the 2300 days. Would that be, would you guys be in agreement with that summary?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so we move forward onto the next one. So through my own research, this is what I found to be quite interesting. So you've got the four winds. So I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. So that would have been Persia, Cyrus the Great, from Daniel chapter 8, verse 4. And so the ram was pushing north, the ram was pushing south, and the ram was pushing west towards Babylon. If you could sort of take a look at this particular map of the conquest of Cyrus the Great. Does anyone know anything about Cyrus the Great?
No.
Yes, no, maybe.
You mean like the historical point or?
Yeah, from a historical point, or even from what we've read in the Bible so far.
Ah.
I'll take that as a no.
Well, from what we've read in the Bible so far, sorry, I don't have the text right now, but he was prophesied quite a while before he actually conquered Babylon. So the Bible mentions him by name, and there's also another verse that actually mentions how he was going to conquer Babylon. Because there's a strategy that he used to actually overthrow Babylon while one night they were feasting and they didn't close the gates, and he drenched out the river Euphrates, I think it was. So his soldiers could pass by when it was shallow and then overtake the city without much resistance.
Yeah.
They were partying during that night. When that whole writing on the wall was what is it? Was it Belshazzar?
Yeah.
Yeah, when they was writing on the wall for Belshazzar, that's the one. I can find the verses while you carry on talking, then I'll mention them later on if you want.
Yeah, I think that'd be very useful. It's interesting that you mentioned Belshazzar because Daniel had this dream during the time where Belshazzar was actually the king, right? So just to kind of set the tone, or what I'm trying to do or trying to achieve with this is to solidify the Bible's authority as a historical as a historical source, so to speak. So it goes without saying that even in secular history, Cyrus the Great is known as the Great King of Persia, so to speak, and he took over from Belshazzar while Belshazzar was in the height of his sin, and they were drinking from the goblets and the plates that were made for the sanctuary, so to speak. So you've got, hold on, slideshow.
Hello?
Hello?
Before you go to the next slideshow, so I have one of the verses here. Thank you very much, Tadi, for that. So it's Isaiah 45, starting from verse 1 to about 13, but I'm just going to read a bit of it. So if we know the history of the Bible, Isaiah was written before Daniel. So whatever I'm going to read was written way before the events in Daniel actually happened. So Isaiah 45 verse 1 says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-levered gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I'll go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which called thee by thy name, am the God of Israel." So here, he says, you will know that I am the God of Israel because I have called you by name before, well, we know that he is the God of Israel because he prophesied Cyrus before Cyrus actually came to be. And he mentioned the things that Cyrus would do as a conqueror.
Okay, and did Cyrus, according to scripture, according to history, Cyrus lived up to that, didn't he? He lived up to that particular, he lived up to his, to the prophecy, so to speak, isn't it? No one, as the scriptures would say, no one could stop him at the height of his power, so to speak. Does that make sense? Does that work? Yes. Or would that be yeah? Yeah. And so after Cyrus, if you can still see my screen, after Cyrus, then we've got Greece that took over from the Persian Empire. So we have an interesting dynamic here because initially you had the East coming, so it's like almost like an east wind coming from the East, taking over everything that was in the South, in the North, and in the West, right? As far as I'm aware, back in those days, whoever controlled the East controlled the world, so to speak. Nowadays, it's the tables have turned. Whoever controls the West pretty much controls the world. Control being a very, very, for lack of a better phrase, or let's say influences the world, shall we say. In this day and age, if you control the West, you influence the world much greater than if you control the East, unless and if you have some kind of oil, if you strike oil, and then that's a whole different conversation. So we've now got Greece coming from the West here, right? And this is the male goat that was being spoken of. And as Eugene pointed out, that the Greek had a coin, which was Alexander the Great's coin, which was son of the goat, so to speak, he was referred to as the son of the goat, or son of the greatest of all time, as it were. So you've got Greece coming from the West, and you've got Persia, and he ends up conquering Persia, which was from the East, and he takes over effectively the then known world, being pretty much obviously Greece, Macedonia, and takes over Egypt and Lydia and Persia. And then Alexander dies, as you did in your study last week, and then he gives his kingdom to the four generals, or the kingdom is taken over by his four generals after he passes on. And so the new map of the world after Alexander the Great looks something a little like that. So with Babylon right at the center, would that be, again, Egypt being southwest, Persia, everything on the east, and you've got the Macedonians or original Greece on the far west, and what could be argued to be northwest, being Thrace and Asia Minor and the rest of the other nations of the then known world. It would be fair to point out at this point in time that at this point we haven't reached Rome yet, right? And as you can see, the limitations of, according to history, that is, the limitations of the Grecian Empire after Alexander the Great, and even during Alexander the Great's time, did not necessarily conquer Rome or take over Rome. So Rome, at this point in time, is an entity that's still in existence. It is in existence, but it's not under the rule or the strict or direct rule of Alexander the Great. But as we said before, if you control the East, you pretty much influence the whole world, so to speak. And as far as history would tell us, the Romans actually admired the way the Greeks were doing their things. In fact, they especially admired Alexander the Great, mostly because also he was not one conqueror to try and impose his will, I'll phrase that lightly, over people, but more so tried to ingratiate the people by taking on their cultures and not actually eradicate them, as we've had in other empires that came after that. So there's a point to argue over here, because the interpretation of the Bible that we have will tell you, depending on which Bible version you're reading, you would hear the words that, or you'd read it as the new empire that was to take over from the Grecian Empire. It came out from one of the four horns. So four notable horns came up toward the four winds of heaven, and out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the east and toward the glory, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. Now, how would you just interpret that without looking at the rest of the slide, I suppose? What does that say to you?
I think the first thing that comes out, especially when you're reading Daniel 8, verse 8 to 9, I'll read from, sorry, one second. The New King James Version, it says that, where is it gone? Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south and towards the east and towards the glorious land. The first thing that comes to my mind is the concept that they all somehow start small, and then with time they grow exceedingly greater. And I don't know if someone wants to explain that part to me, because for some reason, especially on the part where it says that, and out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. Why is the reason why, for some reason, they all start off small? They don't start off as these great things, but then with time, they gradually become something greater.
My addition to that would be that if we just look at the history of, just for example, colonization, it starts off with, one country going on into to invade one country or taking over one country, and then with hunger, you just want to get more and more and more. And as you conquer more countries, your power grows as well. So I think that's what happened with them. It wasn't just that they took over one small territory and that was it. They kept on moving towards that direction and taking more territories towards that direction. And with that came more power as well.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to comment that I think what it means here for me, what stands out the most for me is the fact that this horn is growing extremely great toward the glorious land. And I think from looking at it, and looking at these maps that we've been looking at, I feel like this power was actually spreading towards like Israel. So because like when, I don't know if you could, show the map that you had earlier, but these powers were almost centered around like Asia Minor, but this power is actually going towards Israel. I think that's my interpretation. I'm not sure if that is completely, yeah. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. So looking at that map, my interpretation of verse 9 is actually that this male goat's power actually spread towards, I don't know if you look at this map where it says Arabia, going down towards Israel. but I don't know if that's correct. Yeah.
I would actually argue that it is correct. Because as I was saying earlier, in those times, if you conquered the East, or rather whoever had control over the East controlled the world. So as Nigel clearly pointed out, you'd start with one territory, but it's not enough. I don't know what drove men to want to take over every territory they came across, or to spread their wares across the world, but that's pretty much how it started. So it's actually interesting because obviously Babylon at one point or another controlled Israel, so to speak, when Nebuchadnezzar was king, and even in the time of Cyrus, there were still slaves. Until Daniel's intercessory prayer, there were still slaves within Persia. Anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, until Daniel's intercessory prayer, asking God when they were going to be released from slavery, they were under control of whoever was in control of Babylon. My timeline work is a bit rusty, so I'm not entirely sure if that included the time of Alexander the Great. However, it's fair to say that if they controlled Babylon over Rome, then controlled Babylon and took over, or rather, let me not say Rome, the little horn, shall we say, as it took over, if it controlled Babylon, I would argue that you are right in saying that it did control the promised land, as it were, or the glorious land rather. However, I think it's different because in this particular case, for the rest of them, the focus seems to be mainly on Babylon, where even if you read in other prophecies of the Bible, the focus was on Babylon, but even while Israel was in slavery, whatever was happening in Israel was still under the control of Israel. For example, they were still being run by a different king, but not with direct influence, whereas Rome did something different, where they had direct influence into what was happening in Israel. Does that make sense? So even within the time of Jesus, for example, you could see, I mean, if Jesus could say a phrase like, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, that means that everything that was actually happening within his time was controlled by the Roman government. I think having to discuss with Pontius Pilate whether or not you could murder someone, that's giving authority to the Romans, whereas prior to that, the religious powers of the priests and whatnot, in spite of being in slavery, if I'm not mistaken, again, please correct me, they were still under the run of the local priesthood or the local kingship, who had his allegiance towards whoever was running Babylon at the time. Can anyone offer an opinion on that, or am I just running my mouth here?
Okay, I'm gonna rewind a little bit for the sake of context. So as far as I'm concerned, remember I was saying last week that when it comes to prophecy, I'm not I'm not much of a scholar as some of you guys over here. So as far as I'm concerned, right, I feel like there is a connection between, I don't know if you guys had covered this in the beginning, but I wasn't in yet. And the part where it talks about, especially because we did chapter 2 and chapter 7, right? In terms of the vision and the dream, and then there was the statue, and then there were the animals that were described. And then here, am I wrong in seeing certain connections between the ram that is described here and one of the animals in the last dream in chapter 7? I'm trying to get that animal. I think it was the bear, where it says in Daniel chapter 7, verse 5, it says, and suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said thus to it, arise, devour much flesh. And if you read in Daniel chapter 8, I feel like I'm going back, but I just wanted to clarify one thing. it said, Daniel chapter 8, verse 3, it says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw there standing beside the river, there was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." Am I right in connecting the two together?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what that represents is, is it the Medes and the Persians? The Medes and the Persians had those were 2 kingdoms that came together to form an alliance, to then overtake Babylon. One of the kingdoms was greater than the other, and the one that was greater came up after the other one. That's what that's alluding to.
It was Darius that was, so he was the king of the Medes, and then Cyrus was his nephew. So he's the one that took over eventually. So the ram is a representative of Middle Persia.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So this is definitely a clarification in the sense that we are not talking about Babylon here. We're talking about Middle Persia. So we've actually skipped the point in terms of if I'm looking at it from the statue point of view, we're not looking at the head now, we're in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this vision came to him just before the end of Babylon's reign. So it just starts straight into
Middle Persia. Okay.
And there's just one thing I want to add as well. So just about the greatness of these empires. So if you go to Daniel 8 verse 4, at the end it talks about the ram becoming great, right? So that's Middle Persia becoming great. And then verse 8 talks about the goat, which is Greece, waxing very great. So the he-goat waxed very great. And then verse 9 talks about the little horn. It waxed exceedingly great. So every empire is getting greater than the one before it. So that's maintaining the theme of Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, where whoever comes after the other one is greater. So I like that. It's great, very great, and exceedingly great.
Sorry, can I just comment on that? Isn't Daniel 2 and 7 the other way around, where we see gold and we got down to less kind of less valuable minerals? So in a sense, Babylon was greater than everyone else, pretty much, where this one is getting greater and greater.
That's right. So for Daniel 2, the minerals are definitely getting sort of weaker as you go down. Mm-hmm. However, the kingdoms themselves are still greater in the sense that they occupy a greater territory. Okay. So and so what happens is, yes, they are weak, but they may not have the strength in terms of political strength or even military strength as the ones before them. But actually, the fact that they overtake them means that they kind of do have that strength. Yeah. But at the prime of the preceding kingdoms, they probably wouldn't be a match at their prime. So Nebuchadnezzar, for example, he was like the greatest king for Babylon. And then the kings that came before him were not as great as he was. But he was literally at the, he was top dog.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry, Karen.
Sorry, go on, Terry.
No, I was going to say, so just to clarify, Eugene, you're sort of saying that in terms of greatness, it was a case of how much they were able to occupy as they were, or how much territory they were able to occupy as they were moving towards, something along those lines. Yeah. But it's just basically the territory that they're basically occupying, how much they are, that makes them as great.
Yeah.
As time goes by. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also if you think of it this way, like Nebuchadnezzar, he was like the guy who was king by himself, ruled so much of the world, but there was no one who he was in an alliance with to that level that it undermined his power, if that makes sense. He was their great king, whereas in the Medes and the Persians, when they come together, there's some kind of power then distribution there because there's 2 different kingdoms coming together. Alexander the Great did rule, but his was very short-lived and it was just divided up and they were all fighting for it. Because I know we say, the Bible says it broke into 4 kingdoms, But, there was a process before it got into those 4 kingdoms. These guys were fighting for the kingdoms viciously. Their kids, their whatever, they just were fighting nonstop just to get to it. So yeah, I think it is representative of Babylon, very precious. He was the only king, unchallenged in that manner. Then as it goes down, even though they're stronger, they're just also not at the same time because of all the fighting and the power grabbing that was happening.
Can I just throw a spanner in the works here? Just some food for thought, and y'all can again feel free to disprove and argue and whatever. But could the weakening, just jumping off of Josiah's point, could the weakening or the dropping in value of the minerals, as they were within the statue, could that point towards a growing moral decay within the societies? So, for example, I'm not saying that Babylon was of a higher moral standard than Rome, but could that be a symbolic of that? I mean, just basing it off of Nebuchadnezzar's reign himself, the amount of times you hear Nebuchadnezzar praising God, actually, even after he gets turned into an animal, and then he turns back, and then he praises God. It literally does say he worshiped God for the rest of his life, so to speak. In comparison to what we know of the latter empires that took over, could that be something to take away from the complete sort of weakening or in value of the materials used within the statue?
Are you saying that as the statue is getting, from head to toe, did you say it's weakening in what? Sorry, morale?
Moral, as in
okay.
Moral fiber, moral decay. So I mean, you've got gold. Gold is like the greatest commodity, or the most valuable commodity on that statue. And then you go into silver, and then you go into bronze, and then you go into iron, and then you go into iron and clay. Surely, if you think about it, it's getting less and less valuable as you go down, or less and less, less and less valuable, weaker, whatever you want to term it.
I always looked at it as like what Eugene was saying. Maybe it makes it was the unity, where at the beginning, like Eugene said, you start under one king who has control of everything. There's no question. Nebuchadnezzar's the head. What he says goes. Then in the next kingdom, you already have 2 different kingdoms having to come together. And you've got Greece, and then you've got Rome, which is union of states. And by the end of the statue, you have to have 10 kingdoms with different toes representing things, because they can't stand on their own and they have to create an entire union to come together. Whereas before, as you go up the statue, the powers are on their own without the need of other people.
I think it could be what you said. Oh, go on.
Oh, sorry, go on. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, it could be what you said, Dion, that it was just a reflection of moral decay. Or it could just be a countdown in terms of time. So we are moving closer to the end of time. So from the top to the bottom, the minerals, them going down in value could literally just be a countdown towards the end of time.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree with the moral point, because I don't know. Because you remember in the Babylonian times, they didn't really, the kingdom itself was not really rooted in God whatsoever. The only way that they got to understand God was through, or how Nebuchadnezzar got to understand God was through Daniel and his people. So we understand from the reading. I imagine if the king was not godly, I don't know how much of the people were actually godly or adhered to moral standards that were of God. So I'm not saying no, but at the same time, I don't know if I would agree with that based on what is written. But I do agree in regards of, sorry, what is this? The point that Tadi mentioned about how the kingdoms would be, it was one king, but also somebody once mentioned that in regards to knowledge, infrastructure, and the things that they were building in Babylon, I don't think there's been a kingdom that has been able to do the things that they were doing. Because if a man can build a statue made out of pure gold. That is it 70 cubits? Is it 70 cubits? Yeah. If you can build pure gold, that is 70 cubits high. That is some serious stuff right there. You know what I mean? The amount of knowledge it takes to do that, the amount of engineering, Dion, that you actually need for that. You know what I mean? It's pretty special. And I don't think there was a kingdom that came after that paralleled that amount of wisdom, that amount of technology, etc. Yeah.
I mean, the only reason why I pointed that out was because, like you rightly said, that if your king is not rooted, doesn't have any moral fibers, is not rooted in God, then how can your nation be so? If your leader is not, then the nation follows what the leader does more often than not, especially in these times. We're living in a democracy. So whatever the king did, the people did, right? So to speak. Nebuchadnezzar allowed himself to be influenced by the likes of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which means that whenever he was, no matter how volatile his relationship with God was, but whenever he was following God, then it follows that the nation would have respected God a little bit more. Contrast that to the Grecian Empire, which had X amount of gods, Zeus, wait, what are some? I know Zeus, and then I know, I can't remember, someone starts the P, and these gods of lightning, gods of water, Erudite, and whoever and whoever and whoever. And you sort of kind of, you're kind of leaving the influence that God has on the people, on the nation that has taken over, in comparison to Nebuchadnezzar and even Darius, who allowed himself again to be influenced by Daniel, so to speak. Because the moment that Daniel was put in the lion's den, Darius was grieved. You know, the moment those Hebrew boys were not burnt by the fire, Nebuchadnezzar was like, whoa, what's going on here? You know, whereas within the Grecian Empire, you kind of didn't have that. And obviously following on now, moving further towards this little horn that we have to discuss, there's less and less influence from God's people, so to speak, onto whoever is leading the known world at that time. That's literally the only reason why I kind of brought that up. I can't ignore that similarity, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I've just got we've got one of our comments from the live feed, and it's coming from Michelle, and she was asking that she said, "Hi guys, just a question. Could the minerals also represent the actual wealth of the kingdoms? Babylon was known as the most splendid kingdom," and I think that's something that we spoke about in terms of how things were going. I think was it Luchin who was talking about the statue, the gold statue that was built. So I think Michelle's basically just asking that, could the minerals represent the wealth that the kingdoms had?
Yeah, because there's someone that Pastor Mark Finley did based on the world economy and how things have changed. Because if you look at Babylon, it was apparently it was the richest city that ever was on earth, because the way that they actually built. And even if you look at now, for you to get gold whereby you can build a statue that high is basically next to hard. Do you get what I mean? But yeah, I'll find the link and I'll send it, because it actually explains how the whole world economy is actually kind of gone down.
Yeah, to that point as well, you know how nowadays our governments are constantly printing money that is actually not in line with the amount of gold that they actually have. That means we have a lot of paper money which doesn't actually equate well, it's not money because it is just paper being printed, but it's not backed up by the gold that is actually there. So there's not a lot of gold now as there was back then. Back then, their currency in Babylon, I believe, was actually gold. You actually dealt in real gold. So that was actually, so yeah, to that point by Michelle, I think that is very, very true, that back then they were very, very wealthy and they dealt in actual gold. Whereas now it's not something so easy that you can just find. As the kingdoms went on, it wasn't so easy.
No, I totally, I actually agree with you on that, because if you look at the world economies right now, if I remember correctly, and again, it could be shot down, but the idea that, or each country prints money according to the value of the resources that it has. So the more gold you have, the more money you can print. That can be up to the value of the amount of gold you have. Unlike our Zimbabwean economies, who think that they can just print money because they have the paper. So it would make sense that it does correlate to how much or how rich the nation was. I mean, we all know that the Iron Age was effectively Rome's age anyway. The Bronze Age was effectively the Grecian Empire. And to be fair, I'm not sure whether silver really did equate to the Medo-Persians as far as history is concerned. I don't know if they ever referred to that, but we definitely know that gold and Nebuchadnezzar were the best of friends.
Sorry, are we moving on, or can I ask my next question?
No, you can ask your next question. So we just did a quick point here because we haven't even touched the second half, the bigger half of Daniel chapter 8. And so just for our viewers out there, we will be continuing this next week onto the next part, because there's so much information, we'd rather not rush it. Sorry, go on, Tari.
Oh, okay. I think my question was just basically tied on to verse 8 to, no, sorry, verse 9 to verse 12. I don't know if it's okay if I can read it out and then I can ask the question. It says, and out of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground, and he did all this and prospered. My only question is to find out, because I think there's a part where you're talking about how as we were going down the stature, as we were going from kingdom to kingdom, there was a decrease in moral value. Can this also be tied down to that, or am I reaching? Because I mean, you get a kingdom at the end that grows so big to the point where it has the audacity to even, where's the verse, to take away the daily sacrifices that they had and to, yeah.
I'll agree with you because it supports my theory. Now I'm joking. I would think that it does lend itself to that theory, that it does point to a moral decay in the society, because this kingdom did exceedingly far greater evil than all the other kings before it. All the other kingdoms were fighting more or less against each other, but not necessarily trying to attack the glorious land and or God, so to speak. However, this particular kingdom had absolutely no care whatsoever. I mean, it's right there in the scriptures. It seems as if it had no care as to how, it had no care as to how, it had no care as to how God felt about whatever they were doing. They had no religious, they had no religious fears, so to speak. They had no moral fears. We do what we want when we want. And blaspheme if we have to get our way. I don't know, would anyone care to weigh into that?
I also wanted to say that it might not completely tie to this moral decay, but I would like to also make reference to the fact that in chapter 7, this beast now is dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong. So I would like to make reference to what Nigel said earlier about this obsession with actually gaining more power by like conquering more land. Almost to, and when it comes to this very last, this very last, this little horn, it's to the point that like this obsession with having power is so great that it's almost challenging. It's even challenging God's authority at this point. So I guess it might actually just, it may relate, it does relate, of course, to moral decay, because as time goes on, things are just getting worse in the world. But then I feel as though it can also relate back to this obsession with being the greatest, like you said, the greatest of all time, but like being the greatest in the world, and having immense power to the point that now you're even challenging God. So I guess that's what it's actually in reference to.
Just a final comment on that. In fact, as we discussed this last week, right? They're going around conquering more territories. The more territories you have, in as much as you're greater, but it becomes harder to control, no? It's harder it's easier to be a dictator in one tiny country than it is to be a dictator across the world, so to speak. So in order to keep your position of power, and in order to stop or to mitigate the chances of, or the risk of you being assassinated by your peers and your trusted advisors and counselors and so on and so forth, wouldn't it be better then to start giving in to their wants and needs, to what they want? So if you've got so many provinces to cater for, so many people to rule, wouldn't it be easier to ingratiate them and do what they want, or to kind of follow more or less what they want and their needs, so that they don't turn on you, and you get to keep your position of power, and you get to keep your, you get to stay in control for longer. And then wouldn't that lead to you sort of compromising your beliefs and things like that in order to ensure that your position is not attacked? I mean, again, I could just be spewing rubbish right now.
No, I get what you're trying to say. I feel like now this horn actually does the opposite now. It's either you can give in to the people, or you could be incredibly grotesque and keep them down and keep your power by exerting like just how much power you actually have. So in this manner, I think what's important as well is in Daniel 2, when you look at the toes, you've got these 10 kingdoms, and it's a mixture of clay and iron. When you get to the toes, it's that spread of power, because you have included, like you've tried to include a democracy, if you get what I mean. I don't know if we're thinking in the same line, but then because you don't want to compromise that, I think that's why it has to be, that kingdom has to be so grotesque to maintain its power, if you know what I mean. I don't know. Maybe we're just.
I think we're saying two very similar but different things at the same time. I say this because, in fact, we might actually end it here. Before I summarize that particular point, does anyone else have anything to say for today before we move on to close and continue on next week?
I mean, I wanted to hear your summary first, then maybe I'll have something to say about what you were just talking about now, you and Nancy.
Yeah. Okay, fine. So what I was gonna say was that this again we'll touch upon next week. We'll go into the deeper detail next week, in fact, of the history, this mysterious horn that starts little and grows ever bigger from these four winds. The way that it conducted itself as the horn, it wasn't actually just purely ingratiating. They used force when they needed to. So it's one of those situations where I come in and the first thing I do is try to be your friend. Failing that, I'm going to beat you down. So it's one of those things where it's either you're my friend voluntarily, or rather I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. Either you take my offer or I force you into you. If you take my offer, you've got something to gain. If you don't take my offer, then I beat you down anyway and I take what I want, and then you've lost everything. So that was the kind of mantra that they kind of worked with in order to ingratiate people. So then effectively that's how you end up with a mix of iron and clay, because then they have to mix. Otherwise, you just have, if it was just a grotesque takeover, I'll submit to you that it would just be iron toes, because it's a grotesque takeover. Whereas if we're mixing, that means that I'm allowing you to, we're coexisting, we're symbiotic, as it were. I'm allowing you to do you, and you're allowing me to do me. And where we differ, because I'm greater, then I might just exert a bit more force than is required. That's what I'd say to you on that point, Nancy.
I guess we're.
Sorry, go on, Nigel.
Yeah, I was going to say, we were talking about, is it the little horn that was headed towards the Holy Land?
The promised
Yeah.
land, yeah.
Yeah, the Promised Land. At the moment, we haven't yet disclosed why it was going there. We're still on our way to get to that point. So we might, just to add some suspense, because we haven't gotten to that point yet, but just to add some suspense, if we read the Bible, you see this happening over time, that the children of Israel, they misbehave, and God says, I'm going to take a stick and I'm going to smack you, you know, and then it sends them over to their enemies, and then they're taking over for a number of years, right? And it just to give you a verse, if you read Ezekiel 39:22, just as an example, but there's so many verses throughout Scripture where this is said, where, and this is according to the New Living Translation, Ezekiel 39, verse 23, it says, the nations will then know why Israel was sent away to exile. It was punishment for sin, for they were unfaithful to their God. Therefore, I turned away from them and let their enemies destroy them. So I know at the moment we haven't arrived to the reasons why that horn was headed towards the Promised Land. Could it be that instead of more being a point of moral decadence on the side of the little horn's side, could it be because of something that the people in the Promised Land were doing that led for that to happen? Just a thought for, I guess we're going to get there next week and actually find out the actual reason why.
Yeah, I'd honestly hold on that point, write it down, and then we can come back with it next week. Luke Chin?
Yeah, no, I just find it very, very fascinating that, you know, a lot of things that were happening in Israel also meant a lot on the big stage, if that makes sense. So right now we're studying the big stage, what was happening in regards to the kingdoms around Israel, Jerusalem. And at the same time, whatever was happening on the big stage, based on the Bible, was directly impacted by the Israelites' behavior. Does that make sense? By how they tend to God or how they tend away from God. And that's how then God's wrath was then brought upon them through other nations. So what I see is, I see God bringing about, I don't know, judgment through Cyrus to Babylon. I see God bringing judgment to Israel through all these other kingdoms in the Bible, when he mentioned so many times that Israel kept on turning away from him to the point where their iniquity was full. And
I think you're answering the question now.
Huh?
I think you're answering the question now.
Wait, what am I?
Yeah.
It was meant to be left in suspense, but
Oh, well then. I am so sorry. You know what? I wasn't even thinking about that. I was just trying to relate this to how we're, you know, our actions can directly impact.
We wanted the cliffhanger and you just took it away.
And then
I took you over the cliff. I am so sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. You know what? Let's leave it there. Sorry.
I think we can easily say Lucian has given us the cliffhanger, because obviously this is something that we can continue next week. I'm just going to add on as well that because I feel like you guys answered my question in a roundabout way. You got there, but my question was somehow in the context of how is it maybe that, you know, especially because I was very concerned about this part where he says that he even exalted himself as high as the Prince of the Host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. And my question was going to come back to the concept of what daily sacrifices were taken away and why were they taken away and what impact did that have on people's relationship with God. But it's okay. We're leaving it on cliffhanger, so I suppose we'll answer it next week. And yeah, I'll turn
Sorry,
it
guys.
to
I'm
you.
sorry. My bad.
So if no one else has anything to add, we just want to thank those that are watching live, those that are watching on Facebook, those that are on this call. Thank you very much for joining us as we study prophecy and Daniel. And just to explain how we came about with this, and you can share with your friends and whatnot. Obviously, we're living in a time where we've got the coronavirus kind of going around, and there's a lot of people and a lot of posts within WhatsApp groups and church and this, that, and the other. Everyone's sort of signs of the times, prophecy, da 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 da. And so we decided as a group of friends to kind of really study prophecy for ourselves, rather than go off speculation. You mean you see a tower and it's 5G, it's pointing out to the end of the world, da 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 da. So we've decided to kind of bring it upon ourselves to study prophecy. And hopefully while we're studying, we don't know all the answers. I don't know all the answers, neither does anyone else on this call. But while we're studying, we hope that you can get a good grounding in prophecy. You can get to know some of our own little quirks within our group of friends. Also, you could feel free to join in the call and ask your own questions, send us questions, and maybe we might be able to answer them as we go along. Hopefully when all of this is over, we'll have a better grounding in what prophecy means, and not just the doom and gloom side of it, but the fact that prophecy is really there to help us understand the sacrifice that Christ actually really made for us in order for us to be saved, and the grace that lies therein. So we just want to thank you for joining us. And yeah, oh, there's another message that yeah, if you do have any questions to ask, any questions you want to ask us, so send them to, can we send them to Zustaf, Tari?
Yes.
And then yeah, if you can send them to Zustaf through the week. If you read the chapter through the week, so we're going to be continuing Daniel chapter 8 next week, the second half of it. So if you do read ahead, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to post them to us. Hopefully if you can do that by I'd say Thursday or Friday, we would have answers for you by the time we start the study at 4 p.m. next Sabbath. We just want to thank you. Oh, and also please do read chapter 9. Sorry, this is my first time doing this, so if I keep going back and forth, I do apologize. Yeah, please do read chapter 9, because chapter 8 and chapter 9 are very, very strongly connected. So we just want to thank you again for tuning in with us, and hopefully we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you very much, Brother D.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right, guys.
Hi, guys.
Now he speaks.